Welcome to the DepthCharge podcast, where we go beyond the sound bites and talk to scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs working on the world's most pressing problems. I'm Kirit Basu, and I'm curious about how we can solve climate change, food security, energy, education, and a host of other issues facing our world today. In this episode, I speak to Dr. Vikram Adve. Vikram is the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Digital Agriculture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he leads the AIFARMS Institute. AIFARMS is one of a handful of national institutes for artificial intelligence research in the US. There, they are focused on foundational AI and science research to address important challenges facing world agriculture. Vikram is a professor and university scholar at the University of Illinois, and amongst his very many achievements, he previously co-led the development of the LLVM project, one of the most significant developments in compiler technology in the last couple of decades. In this conversation, we talk about the state of AI in agriculture and the ambitious goals of the AIFARMS Project. Vikram, thanks so much for joining me on this podcast today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. This is likely to be very interesting.
Awesome. So, AIFARMS, you're the director of this project called AIFARMS. Tell us about it. What is it? What's it all about?
Sure. It's a project that's very dear to my heart. So, broadly speaking, agriculture is a domain that has had relatively lower impact of advanced technologies compared with most other sectors of the economy. And even though there are many opportunities for computing and engineering and now AI to have significant impact on agriculture, there there are still many challenges in many areas that have not had that kind of that have not really taken advantage of these technologies. And at the same time, agriculture faces some really important challenges because um, uh, the world population is expected to grow 70% in the next 30 years. And so we have to increase the quality of food, we have to make it more nutritious. And at the same time, we can't use more land, we can't use more people, we can't use more resources. In fact, we have to reduce our environmental impacts. So that kind of demand on agriculture is unprecedented. It's really, really serious. And so, what we are trying to do in AI Farms is to look at aspects of this broad problem where AI and advanced computing technologies could have a significant impact, could make it easier to tackle this broad problem of growing more food with less environmental harm.
When I think about really technology or advanced technology and farming, my mind goes to, as a layperson coming into this, my mind goes to the big, I should say gigantic combine harvesters that are
Yes.
apparently fully automated, etc. And then, of course, you keep hearing of startups who've come up with these little robotic, systems to go pluck fruits and stuff like that. So, from your perspective, what part of that spectrum are you trying to solve for? Is it the lower end of the market, shall we say, or that very high end?
Well, first, that what you described is autonomous machinery, autonomous equipment is just one small part of the whole problem. There are overall many aspects of agriculture that are not just defined by this sort of trade-off, right? Um, in fact, I think one question that is worth starting at as a starting point is to ask how AI could help in agriculture. And very broadly, we think about it, and this is oversimplifying a little bit, but I think it's a fair way to think about it. Is that there are two very broad ways in which AI can impact agriculture. One is on labor. So in labor, there are a couple of broad problems. There are areas where there are labor shortages, like in harvesting, in livestock farming, and so on. And so that's an area where autonomous systems can have a really big impact. But the other area is just the non-scalability of labor. So human labor just cannot deal with um, farms where there are thousands of acres, or weeding, for example. You just can't have people go out weeding these large fields. or identifying disease on plants, or identifying how to do nutrients and things like that, right? Similarly, humans just cannot oversee thousands of animals, whether it's pigs or chickens or whatever you might be managing in a livestock operation. And so labor just doesn't scale. And that's an area where, again, autonomous systems can make a big impact in agriculture. So that's one broad area, which is labor. And in that area, I think the autonomous systems you talked about can be really important. And we, to answer your question, are trying to focus as much as possible on the smaller end of the equipment, because there's a very important downside to very large equipment, which I'll come back to in a moment. But then the second broad way in which AI can have a big impact is that um, a lot of challenges in agriculture really stem from the fact that you have very heterogeneous, very diverse behavior across time scales and spatial scales. So different plants have different behavior, different parts of a field have different behaviors, different, yeah, regions in a state have different behaviors. And you can't even use the same seeds in different parts of a state, because you really want to, if you want to optimize yield, for example, or minimize nutrient use. And there are many aspects of behavior like this. Different animals have very different properties. And so this kind of diversity across time and space is a major challenge in really improving the outcomes in agriculture. And one important way in which AI can make a very big difference is that there's a lot of successful work now in the machine learning world on dealing with large heterogeneous data sources. In fact, you're I think probably have more expertise than I do in terms of actual data management, data analysis, data analytics, and so on. And so I think you probably are aware of this, that heterogeneous data mining, heterogeneous data analysis is a major area, and AI has had a lot of success in this, and there's continuing to be a lot of research in this area. So these two broad aspects of AI can really make a big impact on agriculture. And a lot of, in fact, all the research that we're doing in AI farms derive directly from these two, or can be traced back directly to these two challenges.
Right. So what's the expected, shall we say, outcome in all of this? Is the goal to essentially just do more research, publish papers, etc., or are you actually building products or equipment or demonstrators?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. For us, it's very much both of those things. So, AI Farms is one of the 7 national AI institutes that was funded by the federal government last year in the first round of this program. And in this program, and for us in particular, it's a very high priority, not just to do research, but also to have real impact on products, on farmers, on other stakeholders. And so we have a significant component in AI farms on technology adoption. So, in fact, we're doing farmer surveys to understand better what kinds of challenges they face, what their highest priorities are. Also, as we develop technology, so for example, one particular solution we're working on right now is using small robots for cover crop planting. Cover crops are an important way farmers can use to improve the health of their soils and the productivity of their farms. And to,
So sorry, cover crops.
yeah, so that's a good question. Cover crops are a a simple, conceptually pretty simple idea, but the idea is that when you harvest a field, what you're left with is bare dirt, and that bare dirt lies idle for often months until you plant again the next season. So over the winter, for example, there's nothing in the soil. And what that means is bare soil is left open to the elements, and you get a lot of soil erosion because of wind. And in fact, the Dust Bowl in the 1930s was directly related to this problem. Second, you get a lot of waste, runoff of nutrients that are left behind in the soil after harvest. And so that runs off into the waterways and causes many kinds of pollution problems. And cover crops can really be very important in addressing both of these, because they reduce erosion and they also use up a lot of the leftover nutrients. So they're basically crops that are planted in the fields, uh, to last between harvest and the next planting season.
Okay.
And they can themselves have economic value depending on what crops you pick, or they can just be tilled and dug back into the soil.
Right.
So then a third benefit that they actually have, which is becoming an important focus these days, is that they can be a way to return carbon, extract carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and return carbon to the soil, which both enriches the soil and reduces the carbon dioxide impact of agriculture.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, I've certainly heard of certain legumes, for example, being, for
Exactly.
example, nitrogen fixers, and
That's
so they
exactly. Yeah.
provide some sort of an intermediate between primary
Yes.
crops.
Yes, and in fact, another interesting angle nowadays is that you may have heard of the carbon bank that the USDA is trying to develop. It's basically a way to pay farmers to reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture and also to create carbon credits that other industries can buy. And so it basically provides a way to both provide farmers some income and reduce the impact of climate change.
So this is the ag version of the energy side of
That's right.
carbon.
It's carbon sequestration. In
Right.
this case, it's carbon sequestration in soil
Yeah.
through agriculture. So coming back to the technology adoption question you were asking, planting cover crops is a cost center for farmers. If there's not enough economic incentive, they're not going to do it. And so bringing down the cost of that is very, very important. It's also important to plant the cover crop early in the season before the plants are harvested. The real crops are harvested, because otherwise the cover crop doesn't take root. And so what we're looking at are small autonomous robots that can do this at very, very low cost and can do it between the crops, like going between rows of corn or wheat, for example, to plant. And so we're actually having farmer uh, workshops or surveys to talk to farmers about their interest in this kind of technology, to understand what might make it easier for them to adopt this. That's just one example of the kind of work we're doing to try and make sure these are adoptable
Right.
outcomes.
So in that particular example, can you talk a little bit about really like the scale of the farmer, right? So if I
Yeah.
have a I don't know an acre or two of land, very small scale thing, does something like that apply to me, or is it primarily mid scale or large scale operations?
Right. So this is a concept that we are making high priority, is what we call scale neutral technologies. Technologies, outcomes that can apply both in small scale and smallholder farms, as well as to the larger kinds of farms that are prevalent in the Midwest. And so, for example, the robots we are talking about, which have actually been commercialized by a startup company that we work with called EarthSense. These robots are in the cost price range of a few $1,000s, and so farmers can buy, two of them if they have a relatively small operation, or they can buy 10 of them or 20 of them if they have a larger operation. And based on various calculations that the developers have done, what they've shown is that a team of 5 of these robots can cover an 80-acre field in a few hours. And so 5 robots would cost far, far less than the typical machinery that farmers use today. And so there's a real benefit to that.
And then what are these robots capable of? Is it the entire life cycle from like sampling to seeding to harvesting, or
So
what is
that's
it?
a good question. So we talk about levels of autonomy. So today, these robots are capable of navigating between rows of corn, especially down straight rows. And then if you give them waypoints, they will be able to navigate around the ends of a row and return back and continuously navigate through a whole field that way. And so, along with that, they can then do a few different tasks. Like, for example, the commercial version, for example, can do things like plant measurements to develop new varieties of seeds. That's called phenotyping. And this is a really important problem. In fact, there are whole companies devoted to enabling high throughput phenotyping to make it easier to develop more varieties of seeds. Or in the research now, one of our goals is to increase the levels of autonomy so that the robots can do more and more tasks in a production form. And so, for example, we're developing a prototype autonomous farm. We call it the farm of the future, where we are starting to develop more and more capabilities. And so, cover crop planting is relatively straightforward. It's just a matter of spraying seeds as the robot traverses the rows, and that's something it can do today. But mechanical weeding, for example, which is another important technology, because weeds are becoming resistant to herbicides, and herbicides cause a lot of pollution and also damage to human health. And so, by mechanically killing weeds, you don't have to use mechanical herbicides. And this is another important outcome that these robots should be able to accomplish, because the actual killing mechanism for weeds is relatively straightforward. The main technology required is autonomously driving around the
Please tell me there's lasers involved in this.
field. Believe it or not, there is actually a startup company somewhere in Europe that sells robots that kill weeds using lasers.
Right.
It has to be very early in the season, but it
Perfect.
can actually work.
The
But
future is here.
it can be much easier than that. You can basically, all you have to do is basically dig up the soil a little bit
Right.
as you're going through, because early in the development cycle, the weeds are very small and
Yeah.
it's easy to do that.
Now, speaking of autonomy, what you're sort of describing these various levels, my mind keeps going to really like in the self-driving car world,
Yeah.
levels of autonomy of driving. It's almost like there's a framework.
There is actually a framework. In fact, we got our terminology from the framework used for autonomous cars.
Right.
The big difference is that, unlike when you're driving on roads with people and pedestrians, the safety constraints here are far lower. It's much easier to have and much safer to have a team of small robots driving around. Typically, the worst thing they can do is to knock over a plant or something like that. Otherwise, it's pretty harmless. And so you can really imagine these robots becoming quite easy to deploy. And the levels of autonomy you're talking about are to go to the point where, in let's say the next 3 years or so, a team of these robots could be operating with one manager sitting in a farmhouse somewhere and communicating with them over some kind of wireless, monitoring their locations, monitoring their activities, and getting feedback about what they're doing. We're not there yet. Today, a robot can get stuck, and a farmer has to follow within walking distance in order to get the robot unstuck. And so, that kind of recovery action is an important part of the autonomy, especially in this is very different from a factory floor. So, autonomy on factory floors or warehouses, you have a much more controlled environment. And so you can imagine, so those systems can be far more autonomous. Here, you're really out in sort of in the open spaces, in unpredictable conditions of weather, of soil conditions, rocks, plants, weeds, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. So, just you mentioned something about the neutral technology. Uh,
Scale neutral, yeah.
Sorry.
Scale neutral is the term.
Scale neutral. So I'm curious, like anytime I think about mostly sort of supervised learning AI, you're giving it a lot of training data. You've obviously trained on the particular environment you're in.
Right.
How much of how different is this? Can you take the same robot, plop it down in some place in Arizona, or take it to New England, and will it just automatically start working, or is there training involved?
That's a really good question. So that's also very much part of the research that we are doing, is to make it easier to train a robot in one setting and then deploy it in a different setting, perhaps with some incremental retrain. So basically through, for example, transfer learning, or it might be that you need some additional. That will really be another form of transfer learning as well, but really just a way to take a robot trained in one setting and move it to a different setting. We found that the learning, for example, with vision-based navigation, the vision-based autonomous learning models are actually quite robust, both in terms of the time of the season, the level of sunlight, the weather conditions, all of these, even whether the rows, what the rows look like, what the what the leaves look like. Early in the season, you have these simple small plants that are far apart, and they're quite green and they're very easy to spot. You get late in the season, you have all these brown leaves. You have a much more shaggy kind of environment with a lot more occlusion, and the models actually are quite robust against this. Now, if you go to a completely different field, like you go from corn to soybean, you may need to do some more transfer learning in order to transfer the navigation.
And, is your sensor for navigation and such, is it primarily just vision, or you're looking at other radar?
So actually, the commercial version so far has used LIDAR, but a relatively cheap LIDAR. It's basically a 2D LIDAR, but cameras these days are far cheaper even than that. And so we've actually done some experiments where we can show that we can do robust navigation with much cheaper cameras and also with much cheaper compute hardware. So we can now use a small Raspberry Pi that costs $35, whereas the previous generation was using an $800 Intel NUC as the main processor. So you can really bring down the cost of the compute.
So wait, just to understand, your Raspberry Pi is basically your navigation system, effectively. That's
Yeah,
the engine for navigation.
yeah,
Oh.
exactly.
And
I mean, it doesn't have to be that. That was an experiment, but we've shown it. That's enough. And so, for example, NVIDIA has this device called a Jetson Nano, which you might have heard of.
yeah,
A Jetson Nano is far more powerful than that. And that would be plenty for this as
right, right. Wow. And in terms of back to the camera system, uh, are you also then thinking about or looking at, say, multispectral, hyperspectral to go examine the plants while you're navigating? Is it like uh, are they two different sort of environments and sensors that are at play?
well. Yeah. No, that's a good question. So there are many tasks that a robot can perform. These small robots can perform. And many of them still require quite a bit of research to figure out what the benefits are to require, what kinds of models are going to be needed, what diseases we can detect. But um, hyperspectral might be useful, for example, for breeding plants, for breeding seeds. If you really want to study properties in much greater detail than you might need for detecting disease. Detecting disease might be possible just with cheaper cameras, especially because hyperspectral is far more expensive than regular RGB cameras that
Right.
you can buy. Basically, these are consumer devices, right?
Yep.
They're much cheaper. And so, in production agriculture, you might want to limit yourself to the much cheaper technologies because that's a much more cost sensitive area. Whereas breeding seeds can tolerate or can absorb the costs of more expensive technologies like hyperspectral. But coming back to the question of what we would do with the robots, so detecting disease, I mentioned cover crops, I mentioned weeding, mechanical weeding, detecting disease is another one. Also harvesting plants and harvesting berries, tomatoes, small um, items or big items for that matter. So fruits and vegetables, that's an area where, as I mentioned earlier, labor shortages are becoming quite acute. And if you can automate that, although if you can automate that, it would be very, very attractive. You'd be surprised that somehow automation has had very limited impact in those areas, even though there have been quite a few startup companies trying to target it. And I think that it's just a very challenging problem. And the levels of autonomy, and in particular AI, really needs to take this much further. And it's one of the reasons why we think that for AI farms, it's not enough just to use today's AI technologies to solve the ag problems. We really need to push the envelope a lot in terms of the AI itself in order to be more successful.
So you're also sort of simultaneously building out the research portfolio, or training the next generation of scientists to go solve these problems as well,
Yes,
presumably.
yes, that's right. So besides the research, there's an important focus on education and workforce training. We want to be able to develop people who have the skills to understand the digital technologies, to be able to use them in practice, to be able to develop um, solutions or tools or train other people in the use of those solutions and tools that are based on advanced technologies, whether it's sensors, whether it's data science, whether it's machine learning, whether it's other engineering and interactive applications, many of these. And so we have, for example, um, a new master's degree program that we're developing. And this is being done by the Center for Digital Agriculture, which is sort of the lead organization on the AIFARMS project. So I also co-direct the Center for Digital Agriculture here at Illinois, along with Matt Hudson, who's a professor in computer science. And in this center, we are developing this master's degree, which is going to be entirely online. And it really is meant for workforce training for people in uh, both ag and technology companies who are interested in digital agriculture from both sides. And this is going to the same courses for the from the master's degree will also be used for certificates for people who want to learn a certain particular set of skills but may not want to spend all the work to do a whole master's degree.
What percentage would you say of farms, whether it's small or big, are actually all in, or all in to whatever extent they can, right? What percentage of it already is, deployed AI or some form of robotic agriculture?
So percentage is a hard metric to quantify, but I can tell you this: it's very, very small. And in particular, there are only a few kinds of products that are actually used in production farming today that genuinely use AI. And in particular, so in large scale machinery, as you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, like in harvesters and combines, those are among the first machines or systems, uh, um, vehicles that have been automated, and they are automated, but the level of AI there is very, very limited. It's really GPS based navigation of a fixed field where you describe the layout of the field, and this thing basically follows a path that you've given it. You more or less pre programmed into it. And beyond that, in production farming today, for example, there are mechanical systems to do automated milking. And they actually do need some level of AI in order to be reasonably robust for different animals and so on. But it's really very limited as far as AI itself is concerned. There's not really machine learning going on there. It's a pretty limited amount of that. Camera systems are being used, so computer vision based systems are being used to monitor livestock and to some extent to look for disease, although to in crops, but to a very limit. I don't even know
Because I know I've
any.
definitely heard of these remote sensing drones for
Yes,
checking health of plants and things of
that's
that
right.
sort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So remote sensing, both from drones and also from satellites, is a much more widespread use. In production farming, drones are being used now, for example, to look for signs of disease, to some extent, even for spraying to a limited extent. Um, Many companies now have what are called variable rate application technologies for nutrients, for fertilizers, for herbicides, and or pesticides. And these are based on, in some cases, the more advanced ones, they are based on actual computer vision and detection or models that detect the need for these kinds of variable rate applications. So that's one of the more widespread uses, I think. These are still relatively high cost, and so the penetration is not very, is still quite low.
Yeah. Do you like, what time frame do you anticipate this becomes much more sort of mass market and accessible to the average farmer?
It depends on the technology. Variable rate is widely used today, as I said, not widely, it's begun to be used today, but there's very little AI actually behind it. I think variable rate is slowly increasing in adoption. Um, I would say in the next maybe 10 years or so, you could see variable rate technologies being significantly more widely used in advanced countries. Now, this is mainly in developed countries. I think in the less developed countries, especially where you have much smaller farm holdings and much more labor potentially, you may actually see much slower penetration in those areas. Another one that I think is going to be more widespread soon, perhaps in the next 5 to 10 years, is uh, harvesting using robots. Also, monitoring of livestock, because livestock operations are again an area where labor shortages are being felt very acutely.
Right. Now, in the work that you folks are doing, is your scope at this point primarily the U.S., or is it a more worldwide sort of collaboration going on?
Well, so the Center for Digital Agriculture is not necessarily just US. It's very much focused on problems in other areas as well. AI Farms itself, a lot of the work that we're doing will initially be tried out in the US, but we expect, again, because we are trying to emphasize scale neutral, relatively low cost solutions, we really expect that these will be applicable much more broadly, not just in the US or in other advanced countries, but even in middle income and lower income countries. And that's an important goal. I think that it's not funded by us. So the AI Farms funding itself is mainly for work in the US. That's coming out of this National AI Institutes program. But um, through other funded projects and collaborations, and also through technology transfer to companies that have a very worldwide, a broad footprint worldwide, we hope that we will have an impact across many other regions of the world also.
You mentioned earlier about transfer learning and AI. I'm wondering if what's your sort of use of AI? Is it primarily you're developing these models for those particular areas, or are you basically coming up with breakthrough new models altogether, things that we've never heard of before?
Yeah,
Curious where it stands there.
exactly. So, like I said a few minutes ago, we really want to not just use today's AI technologies for solving ag problems, but also pushing the envelope on the AI side. In fact, one of the things that we spent a lot of time on in planning the proposal and planning the work in the institute is to identify what the fundamental research challenges are for AI that are motivated by the ag world. And these are fundamental in the sense that they apply to many different domains, not just agriculture, but they have a clear impact or can have a clear impact on agriculture itself. And in fact, we identified 6 specific foundational AI research goals, which we talk about when we talk about the research scope within the team. And about a third of our team are AI researchers. And AI, so these are faculty who do research. They have PhD students and postdocs, and you know, AI research is their bread and butter. So they wouldn't be motivated if there weren't problems for them to solve as well. And these 6 problems that I'm talking about, so I can give a couple of examples. One is what's called, what some people call the small data problem, which is that we actually have large amounts of data, that gathering data is not a difficult problem in agriculture. You can Sensors are commonplace nowadays, and new ones are being developed every day. The problem is you have a lot of data that for which we don't have ground truth, and so machine to make machine learning models succeed, as you probably well know, the most successful models to date, the ones that have gained the most widespread attention, like in, for example, facial recognition and voice recognition and others, have come where you have a large amount of so-called labeled data that is ground truth that can be used to train machine learning models. But that's a very expensive and tedious and time-consuming process. And so one of the fundamental research goals for us is new AI techniques that can work with very small amounts of ground truth or labeled data. And there are um, AI research approaches, machine learning approaches for exactly that problem that we are exploring. So, people on our team who are experts in the areas of active learning, transfer learning, crowdsourcing, and others for this problem. And we're then going to be using that for the ag data that we're also collecting. Another example for this is um, in heterogeneous data analysis. So this comes up a lot, for example, in breeding new varieties of seeds, because there are many different kinds of data being gathered about plant properties. And these both are um, diverse in terms of the kind of data and also varying in terms of time and space. But and machine learning models can be trained on this data if we can really push the envelope in terms of how you handle different kinds of heterogeneous data sources. And if we can, and sort of the holy grail problem here is to use models, these kinds of learned models, to predict plant properties for a given gene variety in a given development or growth environment under given management practices. If you can take that set of inputs and predict the outcome for a plant, how tall, how dense, how large, how green, how what kinds of nutritional content and so on the plant would have, which are called the phenotypes. That prediction problem is sort of one of the fundamental problems in biology. And there's a lot of work in trying to use machine learning to do those kinds of predictions.
This reminds me a little bit of genetic algorithms from way back when.
Yep,
You know,
exactly.
tons of different vectors or features, and you're trying to
Yes.
optimize for some really complex sort of objective function over there.
Yes, in fact, we have a strong group of people working on plant phenotyping, sorry, on plant breeding and genetics and high throughput phenotyping, all working together, because these are all technologies that need to work together to really be able to develop the most effective kinds of plants that can be the most environmentally benign and yet be the most sustainable and productive.
You mentioned there were six different areas, and any other
Yeah,
examples?
sure. I can go through all of them quickly. I try not to take too much time on each one. I mentioned the small data problem, which is basically getting enough ground truth. I mentioned heterogeneous data mining, and so machine learning using heterogeneous data sources. A third one is AI for control. So basically, learning-based control, where that's basically the problem of using machine learning based models to control advanced autonomous systems. And so, in particular, to increase the level of autonomy for the robots and drones in autonomous agriculture, we really think the AI is going to be have a critical role to play.
So it's almost like hyperparameter tuning, but for control systems, effectively.
Yeah, except it's not just hyperparameter tuning. It's actually um, developing new kinds of machine learning models that can be used for guiding advanced control systems. And in some cases, actually combining machine learning, which tends to be a kind of black box data driven strategy, with more traditional control systems where you have advanced control. You have a really advanced theory going back many decades for how to control autonomous systems, but those are not as robust in unexpected situations. And so, by marrying these two together, what we want to be able to develop is both highly autonomous systems that are also robust under unexpected conditions. So that's learning for control. A fourth area is federated learning and edge computing. And this is basically the problem of being able to learn in a distributed setting across many different learning agents in large fields, and potentially even being able to have multiple farming companies that might be farming in neighboring areas being able to learn more effectively without sharing their data. So today, neighboring farmers are very going to be very um, resistant to sharing data with competing organizations.
Right.
And so, and also, for example, companies are very reluctant to share data, right? So federated learning is an important strategy for that kind of problem. But edge computing, it has an important role to play there, because a lot of the actual learning then has to happen on the device with relatively low end resources. And edge computing plays a role in many other tasks, including learning for control as well. So, for example, if you want a robot to be able to pick fruit, you have to do a lot of computing on the robot. And that robot doesn't have much compute power typically. So, edge computing becomes a really important problem there.
Right. So like training on the spot almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then a fifth area is human interaction with autonomous systems. And this is especially important where, so we're using, for example, 24/7 video and audio monitoring of livestock as a way for small teams of farmers and farm managers to be able to monitor fairly large livestock operations. Because with the scale of the population that we need to feed, there's just no way to do that with operations with 50 chickens or 20 pigs. It just does not work. Today's operations have literally thousands of pigs and tens of thousands of chickens in them. And in order to do that under more humane conditions, with better animal welfare, with better health outcomes, better, much less disease, much less mortality, you need much, much more monitoring than what's practical today. And so being able to use video and audio as non-intrusive technologies to monitor them, and literally we can do that day and night. So we have an experimental swine facility here on the campus, and we are installing cameras that are capable of all day, all night monitoring with a live video stream. And so we've installed multiple cameras for all stage. We're going to do it for all stages of the development life cycle, and using that to train AI models that can predict their behavior, their health, and all their other outcomes. But now these have to be managed by human supervisors. And so human supervisors need to be able to understand what the underlying autonomous system or autonomous reasoning is doing, what the recommendations, why certain recommendations were being made, why certain conclusions were being drawn from the data by the autonomous algorithms. And so that human interaction with these autonomous systems is a major challenge. In fact, it's one of the prime research areas these days in both human centered computing and also in robotics.
Well, I mean, it's amazing. The scope of this is so audacious that it sounds lovely. I mean,
Yeah, it's really exciting. I think that's one of the most exciting things about it, that we have a really broad team, like a really broad team. And we're able to tackle many different aspects of the problem and do that both on the AI side and on the ag side. So we have really many different foundational research goals on both sides and close interaction between both sides. So one of the things that we've really, I think, been able to be very successful at, and in fact, our advisory board especially remarked on this, is that we have very good integration between the AI and the ag aspects of the team. And we spend a lot of time trying to identify how they will work, how they can really work together to solve problems that matter. And
now you had mentioned that there were 10 other AI national AI centers. Do you work with any of them? Or do you collaborate with
so
those?
we talk to them regularly. There are six other, there are seven in all so far.
Okay.
There's going to be eight new ones this coming year. So that's the second year of the program. Um, we have regular monthly meetings. We're working on a joint paper. Just it's sort of a vision paper, but the uh, each of the institutes is very very broad, and so I think it's fair to say that we have our hands full just sort of getting um, our own centers going, and getting the projects launched and getting the people working, and putting the people in place, and actually in this year of a pandemic, we started in September 1, which was right in one of the peak times. And so hiring, for example, because we have staff positions that we need to fill to make this work. We don't even have an executive director for my center, for my institute, and we just finally managed to interview some last week. So there's a lot of spade work that needs to be done just to get off the ground. But it's very much a goal to be working with these and sharing resources and talking to them regularly. So we definitely talk on a regular basis and exchange notes.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds really exciting because so far, at least from an outsider looking in, AI really has been the purview of Silicon Valley and corporations and enterprise and all of that stuff, with not a phenomenal amount of applications of AI showing up, at least that I'm aware of. So this is one of those places where I can totally see in the next 5 years it's going to be, hey, here is government funded, public funded AI for real good
Yeah.
use,
Yeah.
and hopefully not just for
Yes.
autonomous killing robots and things of that sort.
I totally agree. In fact, I think I want to give a lot of credit to the federal program that is funding this. That when they defined the program, they actually talked about use-inspired AI as being one of the primary goals, and in particular, how AI can have an impact today in many different sectors of the world, of basically human endeavor of the economy. And so, in fact, agriculture was one of the first areas that they said we really need to look at how AI can have an impact on modern agriculture and the practice of agriculture. And our USDA program manager, Steve Thompson, who runs this program for the US Department of Agriculture, um, he puts a very high priority on not just the research, but also on actual adoption of the research outcomes by farmers. The technology can be transferred through companies or it can be transferred directly, but the impact on farmers, including smallholder farmers, including minority farmers and women farmers, as well as other family farms, but actually affecting how they operate and having sustainable outcomes from this work are two things that he really puts a very high priority on. And for all of that using AI. I mean, that's what's exciting, I think, about this.
So speaking of sort of dissemination of this information, where does one tune in and keep in touch with the types of stuff that you guys are doing? Is there a website that folks can go to?
So our website, aifarms.illinois.edu, is our home web page. And we will continue to post results there as we get them and publications and talks and so on. So that's probably the most up to date location to find information about our results. But you will also see occasionally um, press releases or news items that we put out. And I'd be happy to talk again anytime you'd like on just to give you updates on things that we are doing. We're going to have hopefully very soon an executive director, and I think that person also will be available to be able to give you this kind of
Nice.
information. We are going to have a newsletter, so we still need to figure out what is the best way to put that out. But there will be a newsletter that we plan to produce from the Center for Digital Agriculture that will be uh, disseminating information and updates as well.
Great. Yeah, I'll definitely look forward to that, and
Yeah,
I'd love to have you again at some point
I
on
would
the
love to
podcast.
do that. Yeah, very much.
Just thinking from you from a personal perspective, now I've not been a direct user of LLVM, but I've obviously used all the compilers. You have a rich history in a completely, I mean, I shouldn't say completely, but quite a different field. So first of all, just very briefly, can you just tell us what is LLVM for folks who might not be aware?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, so LLVM is basically a software system to build what are called compilers. So all software today is written by humans in high level languages. and then run through a tool called a compiler to be able to convert that into code that can actually be run on a computer. And so that's the compiler is that tool that takes a program written by a human and translates into a program that can be run by a machine. And developing these tools is a very time consuming, expensive kind of effort. And for decades, it was the province of proprietary products from companies. Um, there's a very widely used open source tool called GCC that has had enormous impact in the world for compilers. And in fact, there are many small startup companies that can exist in practice because they were able to use GCC to build compilers for their hardware. LLVM is similar in the sense that it is a system to build compilers, and it is now quite widely used. And maybe to connect it to people's real life experiences, anyone who used an iPhone, an Apple phone, an Apple Watch, or an Apple TV device today is using software compiled by LLVM, because Apple uses LLVM for all of their apps today. And Google and Intel and many other companies are now using LLVM as well.
So the interesting question, of course, is uh, at what point or what circumstances and what inspirations did you have to go from almost sort of pure computer science into solving for ag?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in fact, I still have to think back to figure that out sometimes myself. My background, as you pointed out, is very much in computer science, and primarily in the area of compilers and software systems. In fact, my current research is on edge computing, which is basically being able to speed up computations and perform computations on systems that have very limited compute power, memory capacity, battery power, and so on. And so these are, for example, the computers that run in robots, in drones, in even autonomous vehicles, in AR, VR headsets, and in all your smart devices like a smart speaker or a smart lock or any of these kinds of systems. Right? These are all edge devices. And edge computing is actually a broad area of research now in the computer science community, and that's one of the main areas of focus for us, because you can use compilers and associated software techniques to really optimize programs to be able to run them on these kinds of devices. And it turns out that digital agriculture, is a really important application area for edge computing. So, in fact, I mentioned the six foundational research goals. Edge computing is one of those six goals, because it's one way to make robots far more capable. It's one way to make sensors and sensor driven systems in production farming much more capable. And so that's my own personal interest. In fact, in AI farms, that is my line of work. It's on edge computing. The reason I got interested in this is actually somewhat unrelated. So I was briefly department head of computer science. I was interim head between two permanent heads. And at that time, I happened to come across a vision paper written by the Computing Community Consortium on smart agriculture. And it was eye opening. I really realized how many different problems in agriculture are really ripe for advanced computer science research, and how bringing together computer science researchers and faculty with ag um, researchers could have a lot of value and also interest. And so at that time, I worked closely with the College of Agriculture here, which is one of the major colleges of agriculture in the country, to develop the Center for Digital Agriculture. So we got some seed funding and started up the center and created a lot of fun, small collaborative funded projects that are bringing people together from the engineering side and the agriculture side to work closely together. And in fact, that's how we finally got AI Farms. So this AI Institute is a direct outgrowth of the work we put into the Center for Digital Agriculture.
And then, the final question, I love asking this. If you look back through your entire life, could you name maybe top three, whether it's books or people or movies or instances in your life that are kind of really milestones from a professional perspective that really changed your mind, really sort of changed your thinking on things?
Wow, that's a tough one because one doesn't usually sit and think about these things. Um, so I guess the first one is quite trite in some ways, but I think my dad has been a major inspiration because he grew up, in fact, on a farm, and he could easily have stayed on the farm and I would have become a farmer's son. And he ran away because he wasn't happy with his education opportunities, and he became quite a senior economics researcher in the Reserve Bank of India. And he really, really inspired me and my brothers to go into research driven fields and to do research. And um, I think that's been extremely important in shaping the directions that I followed, both in especially after college, but in college and after college. And so, for example, I have no question I want to do a PhD and go into research long term. Um, Another one is probably that after my PhD, so my PhD was not in compilers, it was in an area called performance modeling and evaluation, where we were using analytical, so mathematical models to predict performance of computing systems. And I honestly found it to be a dead end area. There was really relatively little interest in academia or in other, even industry for that matter, in that field. And I joined Rice University as a research scientist and joined a research group there led by Ken Kennedy, who's quite a successful, in fact, one of the most famous compiler researchers. And I joined Ken's group as a research scientist and actually learned compilers on the job pretty much. And that has completely changed the direction and nature of the work that I do. And so I basically worked on compilers ever since. And I continue to work on parallel computing, which was the what I did in my PhD thesis and in the compiler world. But I've gone away from parallel computing and come back to it. But compilers have been the sort of mainstay of my work. So that's probably the second biggest um, moment that kind of defined a direction for me. And the third was, I think LLVM and the success of LLVM has been hugely important as well. And it came out of conversations that I had with my first PhD student here at Illinois, Chris Latner. Chris was really um, um, the prime mover behind the software design and the success of LLVM in many ways. But we spent many um, weeks and months discussing the idea of designing a novel, basically a novel approach to designing compilers that would have some capabilities that no previous compiler system had. And so, if you've heard of Java, Java is a programming language that's based on something called a Java virtual machine, and that has some novel capabilities in its compilers that only work for a certain class of languages, which are so called managed languages. Conversely, compilers like GCC and many others have certain capabilities that only work for non managed or so called static languages. And there was never a system that combined the benefits of both of those things. And LLVM was really the first and only system that actually combines the benefits of both of those kinds of languages. And it's turned out that in practice, it took some time, but in practice now, commercial products, real world products, widely make use of that combination of capabilities. So, for example, all apps for Apple consumer devices are shipped by the development companies, the application companies, to Apple in LLVM form. And that's the technology that enables this new capability. So they ship it in LLVM form, and then Apple actually does the final step of translating the code from LLVM form to the machine executable form for each particular device. And that capability exists, or in the past existed for the managed languages, but never for the static languages. Now it exists for both kinds of languages because The languages that people use for Apple are either Objective C or Swift, and those are really classically static languages. So, anyways, LLVM and the success of LLVM has been, I think, a major sort of another major milestone.
Nice. And we are, as end consumers of all of that, are very thankful for all the work you've done. So thank you.
My pleasure. And I really enjoyed this conversation too.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much, and hope to chat with you again. And very best of luck for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Kirth. I'm glad you're doing this.